Now, on Daytime on 2, we discover just what radioactivity is, how it's detected, and how it can be used in science topics.
There's nothing new about radioactivity. It's literally been around as long as the Earth. These are the mountains of the Lake District. They're made up mainly of granite, and they're millions of years old. These rocks were ancient, even 2,000 years ago, when the Romans used them to build this fort. And they're radioactive. Not much, but definitely radioactive. Many rocks are naturally slightly radioactive because they contain small amounts of radioactive substances. It's quite natural and quite harmless. It's called the background radiation. But more recently, another source of radiation, a much stronger source, has come to this area. This is the Sellafield works owned by British Nuclear Fuels. Part of the site is occupied by the world's first commercial nuclear power station. But what is the rest of the large works for?
The second more important function of Sellafield is to receive and reprocess nuclear or spent fuel from nuclear power stations.
Most of the fuel which is sent from the power stations is in fact unused uranium. The problems come from the 3% waste. What happens to that?
Now that 3% waste is converted on the site to three distinct levels of waste. Highly active waste, which is stored on site, and the highly active waste is stored in concrete cells containing stainless steel tanks. The intermediate level waste, which comprises less radioactive materials like sludges and ion exchange resins and things like that, these are stored safely now on site in silos, shielded silos. And that brings us to the last one, which is the low-level waste. Now, low-level waste on the site is a miscellany of contaminated clothing, equipment, tools, and the like.
Escape and affect people.
The radioactivity isn't confined to the works. It is discharged through the end of the Windscale pipeline deliberately as part of the waste management policy, and it's also released aerially through the stacks that belong to the reprocessing plant. It gets into the sea, it gets into the seafood such as the prawns and the fish itself, it gets into the air, it gets back on land via the rain and via the tide, and it gets back into people, it gets back into the homes and gets back into the dust, and that's the way it actually comes back to human beings.
Some independent evidence suggests that the levels are not significant, but the health of the local people is very much the concern of their GP.
We know that the sea levels of plutonium are higher the nearer you are to the factory. We know that the sea spray figures are high around here. We know that the fish that are caught off the pipeline here are much higher in radiation. We know that the shellfish around here are. Or because of all these pathways, all these possibilities, the people around here are going to be exposed to more than, say, you are going to be exposed. And as far as people are judging at present, these levels that they are discharging into the environment are not thought to cause damage. However, as knowledge advances, we set the limits at lower levels.
The radiation from the various materials is invisible, and most of us wouldn't know it's there. So are these materials especially dangerous?
They're a very grave concern because they're not only very toxic and very long-lived, But they're very difficult to detect. You can't avoid them. You can't avoid radiation unless you take a Geiger counter out onto the beach with you. And it's the whole health consequence to future generations which gravely concerns us.
Before any of us can help to decide about radioactivity and nuclear power, it's vital we understand more about it. When it was first discovered, radiation was a complete mystery. In 1895, the German physicist Wilhelm Röntgen was experimenting with electrical currents in tubes containing very thin gases. To his great surprise, he noticed that a nearby piece of paper coated with a sensitive chemical was glowing. Within a few weeks, Röntgen had proved that the effect was caused by invisible rays which could pass through solid objects. He didn't know what caused the rays, so he called them X-rays. X for unknown. Just 1 year later, the French physicist Antoine Becquerel was experimenting with uranium. He put powdered uranium on photographic plates covered with light-tight paper. Light couldn't get through, but something did, because the plates were fogged. He decided that the uranium must be giving out invisible rays, perhaps like X-rays, perhaps not. The work was taken up by Marie Curie, helped by her husband, Pierre. It was she who first suggested the term radioactivity for what seemed to be happening. Today, we don't have to use photographic paper. Radioactivity can be detected by a Geiger counter. It reacts to the presence of a source of radioactivity, something which gives out the invisible rays. This radiation doesn't travel very far. With the source only 5 centimeters away, the reading drops to almost 0. And it can't even penetrate something as flimsy as a piece of paper. This source contains a different radioactive substance. This radiation seems to travel further through the air. The reading doesn't get close to 0 until the source is over 10 centimeters away. It's not stopped by paper. Only by a piece of aluminium. A third type of radiation can travel over 15 centimeters through the air. It's not stopped by aluminium, but only by a good thickness of lead. So different types of radiation have different penetrating properties. They travel different distances through the air and require denser and denser materials to stop them. They have been given the names alpha, beta, and gamma, the first 3 letters of the Greek alphabet. This is a cloud chamber. It contains a small amount of alcohol, which when cooled down forms a cloud. It's a way of seeing the paths of radiations. The radiations leave a trail in the vapor. This is alpha radiation. Cloud chambers can be used to see what happens to the radiations if they're in a magnetic field. Alpha radiation bends slightly. Beta radiation bends a lot more. Gamma doesn't bend at all. But despite their differences, they do all have one thing in common. They can all be dangerous.
Smaller doses produce changes in the DNA. That's the genetic material that tells the cells what to do. And these changes in that genetic material may result in the cell dying, it may be repaired, or it may result in changes in the cells. And this can lead to cancers, or it can lead to changes in the material that's handed down from generation to generation.
The main problem here is the discharge of plutonium, an alpha source.
1/4 to 1/2 ton of it's been discharged into the Irish Sea. It's blown about in the wind now where we are. You can see it in the air monitors that people have. And 1/1,000,000 of a gram, if it's inhaled into your lung, can kill you. That's a serious situation. and obviously something has to be done about that.
Alpha radiation is only weakly penetrating, so is plutonium really dangerous?
There is a difference between the penetration of radioactivity and the damage that it does when it's there. The gamma radiation will penetrate a long way, but alpha radiation, when it's in the body, will produce a lot of damage to the genetic material. It's got a high energy.
There's no doubt that some local people are worried about living so near to Sellafield. At the moment, they're concerned about the number of children getting a disease called leukemia. What is leukemia?
Very simply, leukemia is a cancer of the white cells of the blood. This produces an increase in the number of white cells which don't work properly, and eventually you'll die. The incidence of lymphoid cancers, that includes leukemia, in children in C-scale is something like 24 times the regional level. It is something like 10 times higher than you can expect anywhere else in this country. 1 in 60 of the children under 10 in the last 10 years in C-scale have developed a cancer.
1 child in 60. Thank goodness it can usually be treated. Again, the evidence about radiation and its effects come from independent sources. Of course, everybody interprets it differently.
As far as the impact on the people in the vicinity is concerned, then we have no data, no indications, or no evidence to indicate that the discharges from Sellafield are having a harmful effect on the health of the local community.
One can never prove or disprove a scientific hypothesis that easily. What we do know is that there is an increased level of radioactive material in this environment. There is an increased level of malignancies which are related to radiation. That is what one can say. Based on conventional thinking, there is not enough radioactive material in this environment to cause those cancers. But we do know, as you well know, scientific knowledge advances over the years, and it may well be that in 15 years' time we'll be looking back and saying, of course there was a connection.
But it would be wrong to assume that the whole story of radioactivity is one of controversy over nuclear power and the danger of radioactive waste. Radioactive materials have turned out to be quite useful to us. This reactor is used to produce small quantities of special radioactive substances called isotopes. Making isotopes is quite a big business. These radioactive substances are carefully checked and packed before being sent out to the customers. Customers like local water authorities. They use radioactive isotopes. In that way, scientists are able to follow the movement of the pollution by following the movement of the radioactivity. This factory makes paper and uses thousands of tons of expensive wood pulp every week. It's important to make the process work as efficiently as possible. The thickness of the paper is measured by the amount of radiation it absorbs. Constant checking by computer keeps the whole factory running as efficiently as possible. Radioactivity has an important part to play in maintaining the beautiful Parthenon and the other surrounding buildings which make up the Acropolis. Many years ago, there were fears that the buildings might fall down completely, so they were strengthened by putting in hundreds of steel rods. But recently, the rods have caused cracking. The problem was finding the rods again. A gamma radiation source proved to be the answer. Gamma radiation can pass right through the stones to be picked up on large sheets of photographic paper on the other side. When the paper was developed, the cracks showed up clearly. And so did the steel bars. Once the bars were found, the engineers could remove and replace them, saving the Acropolis for the enjoyment of future generations. Of course, by far the biggest use of radioactive materials is in nuclear power stations for the large-scale production of electricity. In the core, the heart of a reactor, some very violent processes are happening. Small particles from atoms of radioactive materials bump into other atoms. The atoms split up and give out more particles. In turn, these hit other atoms. And so the process goes on. This is called a chain reaction. Out of control, it would lead to very high temperatures. But in a reactor, it's not out of control. The radioactive material is surrounded by a substance which slows down the particles. But that would not be enough to stop the reactor overheating. So the reaction is further controlled by putting in rods, which only allow 1 in 3 of the particles to get through. There are all sorts of arguments for and against the use of nuclear power to produce electricity. But as we've seen, there's at least one big problem: the treatment of the used fuel and the removal of the waste. The byproduct of the nuclear power age is the shipment of waste nuclear fuel by road and rail across the country to the Sellafield works. The material inside these flasks is highly radioactive, highly dangerous, and is handled with great care. All the operations are done inside lead-lined concrete chambers. All the handling is done by machines. This machine strips off the outer magnesium cover from the fuel rods. In fact, it's that waste outer coating that is more difficult to handle than the rod itself. It's highly radioactive, but there's nothing that can be done with it except store it on site. It will become less radioactive with time, but only slowly. It depends on something called the half-life. In a radioactive substance, the atoms break up and give out radiation, but they don't all break up at the same time. But there is a pattern for this breakdown. It's often shown as a graph. After a certain length of time, the amount of radioactivity falls to a half of what it was at the start. That time is called the half-life. In the next half-life, the radioactivity halves again. The half-life is a measure of how long the radioactivity will last, and some substances have a very long half-life.
The material that we will be storing as highly active waste, and which we have been storing, comprises a small percentage of plutonium, whose half-life, as you know, is 240,000 years, and that will go on indefinitely. The other material, the intermediate half-life material, is primarily cesium, whose half-life is 30 years. So in terms of 20 years, 60 years, the decay of that material will come down enormously. And within 300 years, which is 10 half-lives, you're down to negligible proportions.
I think it's a very serious condition. When you're talking about things like plutonium, they're extremely toxic and very long-lived. You're talking about radioactive elements that last some 250,000 years. It's beyond our comprehension, really, as human beings to understand that, and it's well beyond the industrial timescale that we know of.
The levels of discharges have been reduced and will be reduced even further in the future. But the low-level radioactivity does have a long half-life. Is it dangerous? What are the long-term effects? Should it be stopped? As yet, we don't really know the answers to these sorts of questions. Yet if we're going to decide about the nuclear power industry, we do need to look to the future.
We must make sure that the discharges into the environment are as low as we can achieve using modern technology. I think we must forget about the cost of these things, because the long-term effects on our children Our children's children may be there, and we may not be able to go back in 25 years' time, 50 years' time, and say, oh, well, we ought to reduce the discharges. I think we've got to think about it now.